Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to another presentation of the online ColdFusion Meetup. I'm Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And in this edition of the meetup, our 257th being recorded, or 256, one or the other, sorry, being recorded on Thursday, November 14th, 2019 at 6 p.m. U.S. Eastern Time. We've got Bruno Zugay, who's going to be presenting on web acceleration to the rescue. Before we get started, I just want to explain a couple things. Folks will notice that there's only a few people here. That's not a reflection of interest in the topic. Of course, it's being recorded, so that's okay. But I want to get this out there for everybody listening on the recordings and for you guys that are here. There's a problem with the meetup site. It puts a time. I have to pick a time. And the time that I put there shows up on the meetup site. And when you click the calendar links, it uses that time. But that time does not have a time zone. And that time does not care what time zone you're on. So I just have to pick a time. And I pick Eastern time. In my notes, I say it's 6 Eastern. And in Twitter, I've clarified it multiple times, but people just seem to be missing it. So there's going to be people showing up at the top of the next hour thinking now's the time. It's not. So we just have to deal with that. I'm There's nothing I can do. It's a meetup problem. Nothing I can do about it. So anyway, with that, Bruno, go ahead and I'll stop sharing and you can take it away. Thanks again for being on.
Awesome. So I will share my screen and let me know
That's
if
it.
you can see
It
my
looks
presentation.
good.
Wow, it's actually
Yep.
working this time. Terrific.
Yeah. All
Yeah,
the
exactly.
technology. Thanks,
Awesome.
sir.
So yeah, let's get started. So this talk is really, I guess, an extension of a talk that I had given at the ColdFusion Summit just a month ago. And we covered a lot in that talk, and the focus was really how to um, sort of scale your websites in a way that can handle a tremendous amount of traffic. One of the topics discussed in that talk was web acceleration by using Varnish. So that's what this talk is going to focus on, as opposed to sort of the whole approach in general. So web acceleration through Varnish. So this is not, I guess, object caching or fragment caching or database caching. This is web acceleration caching, so a different layer in the stack altogether. So types of caching that developers typically worry about and concentrate on is, I guess, would be browser caching. And that is something that I guess you can think of images being cached in the browser, CSS files, JavaScript files, and so forth. Right, the browser itself caches a few different assets so that on subsequent visits, those assets do not have to be requested from the server again. The browser just uses them for performance. We're not going to talk about that today. Data caching as well. I guess this sort of encompasses what you would think when thinking about sort of caching MySQL queries, caching different fragments of ColdFusion objects, and the results from models and things like that. Again, we're not going to talk about that. I'm going to assume that using all the different, wonderful ColdFusion frameworks out there nowadays, that you're taking advantage of these wonderful methods. What we are going to be talking about is web caching specifically. So when I talk about web caching, I talk about Varnish cache specifically, even though there's lots of different options out there. Varnish is one of the go-to ones for a reason. It's very good at what it does, and it's open source, so it's free, and it does get updated regularly. So even though it's open source and it's a Linux box that runs it, it basically acts as a server that sits in front of your web server that can be anything, right? It can be Apache, IAS, it could be a Windows box, it could be a Linux box. It doesn't really matter. To Varnish, your backend is agnostic. And you might be thinking, Varnish, what's up with the name? Why is it called Varnish? And I will share these slides with the link to some history behind the name if you find that interesting. As I have found it in the past, you'll be able to learn a bit more about it. So yeah, take a look at that if you're curious. But let's continue on. So basically, what most of us have found to sort of be a point where things start slowing down when you start hitting a lot of traffic and a bunch of requests is basically you have a web server that is running ColdFusion, or maybe you have a ColdFusion application server apart from your web server. There are two different web servers, but there is nothing sitting in front of those servers and the user itself, right? So the user will request, or basically make a request to your website, and ColdFusion will have to serve it one way or the other, right? So whether it's ColdFusion serving cached objects without hitting the database, or loading images from the web server, ultimately ColdFusion is responsible for sort of serving those pages. And that's when things become very hard to scale, right? ColdFusion is very good at what it does, serving dynamic pages. But at some point you have to look at other options if if your business requires you to serve tens of thousands of pages a second or something crazy like that. So introducing Varnish into this mix here looks something like this, which is very, very simple, right? You have a user that will request a page from Varnish, and Varnish will then say, do I have this page in cache or not? And if I do, I will serve it. And if I don't, I will get it from the web server, which is the source. And that looks something like this, right? So a user talks to Varnish. Varnish will say, hey, do I have this in cache? And if I don't get it from the origin server will then first give it to Varnish, and then Varnish will pass that request back to the user. So this is what that sort of handoff looks like if it's a cache miss, right? If it's a cache hit, you will see that your origin server, your web server, ColdFusion server, basically the server that's responsible for, I guess, serving the initial request, doesn't even have to get involved if Varnish has this page in cache. So it's much, much faster and more efficient. So before I move on to the demo, I know there's only a handful of people here. Any questions so far before I begin? Nope. Awesome. Okay, cool. So I will move on. So the demo I wanted to do here, there's really two parts to it, but I wanted this presentation to be a sort of hands-on demo of what Varnish can do so that you can see it firsthand, as opposed to me just showing, a few different commands that you could use to install Varnish. I wanted to actually show you a true example of what is possible. So I will start, I guess. I just said I was not going to show you these commands. I will not run these commands. I ran that beforehand, but so you understand what was done, I've listed them here. So I've installed Varnish. I have gone into the service settings for Varnish and changed only one thing, which basically tells Varnish to run on port 80. And that is very close to what you will have in production yourself. And it, of course, makes my demo a lot easier without having to worry about Varnish's default port. So after I have made those changes, I updated the default config, which looks something like this. This is the IP address of my test server that I will be using. So here we will see Varnish, a Linux server with a service running on it. It will talk to a completely different web server that is running on Amazon Web Services on IAS, and it's using a ColdBox application. So after I have made those changes, I restarted Varnish, and this is what I ended up with. So this is the IP address that I mentioned, and then I guess I'll quickly just go over what we have here. This is just a very bare bones Coldbox application. I literally didn't do anything other than what is listed in the getting started section of the documentation. Here we have the main event handler. We have the hello event handler, which doesn't really have anything crazy going on here. And then we have a list of contacts, which really just is a model spitting out I guess it's an array of structs, and the struct really just contains an ID and a name. What I did here is just for demonstration purposes, I've created an array that has 1,000 records. And to show you what this looks like, the numbers that we are going to be looking at and trying to improve are these numbers, right? So I have the Chrome DevTools sort of filtered down to just show me documents. We don't need to worry about JavaScript and CSS files now. And this page by default loads in about 60 some milliseconds, which is not too crazy, right? It's actually pretty good. It's an IAS server, and right now there is no caching going on here. If you go to the hello handler, again, nothing is cached here as well, and still about 60 milliseconds we're looking at here. Again, not bad at all. Coldbox is doing very good here. And then we go to contacts, and you will see that, of course, now we have tons more served. And even without anything being pulled from the database, we're sort of still dealing with plenty of content actually being rendered in HTML, and the 60 milliseconds now becomes something a lot more than that. Even if I refresh the page, it stays up there, right? It doesn't go down below 100. So what does it look like with Varnish? Again, this is Varnish in front of an IAS server that is running ColdFusion 2018 and a stock Coldbox install. So we'll pull this up again and look at documents, and you will see that we have gone from 60 down to 40 milliseconds, which is not a crazy difference just yet. And we see that Varnish is serving a page from cache, and so far we have done that 6 times. If I go to the hello world, you will see here that it's 128 milliseconds because we don't have it cached yet. So this request was actually served by the IAS server. But if I refresh this page again, numbers start going down. And finally, if we look at what a cached version of contacts looks like, again, 160 milliseconds, it was not in cache. Previously, I refreshed the page and you can see that number going down significantly. So you can see how, the more your page is responsible for doing, right? To Varnish, it doesn't really matter whether it's a simple hello world type of a page, right? Or whether it's something that serves or sort of renders 1,000, or I guess in this case, exactly 1,000 records, right? It doesn't really matter. Varnish will do a great job at serving that very, very fast. So this is one aspect of what Varnish does, right? It quickly improves the time it takes for the page to return to the user that requested it, right? And if you look at these numbers here, this is not anything earth-shattering. Varnish is running on a Linux box that is a $5 DigitalOcean droplet. It only has 1 gig of RAM, so it's not too crazy in terms of what is happening just yet, unless we look at this page and we go from 158 milliseconds, we go down to 44. Now that is a big difference. So again, the more the page does, the better Varnish is going to handle it, right? And again, when it comes to serving these pages back to the user, there is only one aspect where Varnish shines. There's also other aspects when it comes to concurrency, and I'm going to demo that as well. So I'm going to use Apache Bench to sort of demonstrate what it's going to look like if we make 1,000 requests, 10 requests at a time. So that's really what these numbers mean, right? Apache Bench is going to make 1,000 requests, 10 requests at a time to a non-cached version of this very simple Callbox application. So just for the sake of transparency, I'm going to switch from my one virtual machine that is running Varnish to a different virtual machine so that we actually have apples to apples comparison so that we're not hitting Varnish from the Varnish server to make sure that everything looks good. So I'll run this test, and this is not pre-recorded. This is happening right now. So we will see what numbers we get. Again, 1,000 requests, 10 requests at a time. And we were almost done here. So it took 11 seconds for that test to run. We were able to serve 84 requests per second, almost 85. The average time per request was, I guess, mean 118 milliseconds. And down here, you will see 50% of the pages loaded in this amount of time, and then the worst was 198 milliseconds. Again, nothing too crazy. So if you look at what IAS out of the box is able to handle with ColdFusion, that is about 85 requests per second going to that Coldbox homepage, right? So that is, I guess, one number to sort of keep track of 85 requests per second. I will now go ahead and grab my other command here. So this is, again, same thing, 1,000 requests, 10 requests at a time going to Varnish directly. So I will do that. We'll clear. So we had 85 requests per second previously. Whoops. Okay, there we go. So as you can see, that just ran super fast, and I will clear this again and try and run it. It's crazy fast, right? So we went from 85 requests per second to a little over 2,000 requests per second, and average, I guess, again, mean 5 milliseconds, or I guess less than per request. So again, super fast. So Varnish is not just good at sort of taking something that your server takes a while to process and just serving cache version of those pages. Varnish is also very good at doing a lot of it at the same time, right? So regardless of how your web server, and again, this is not Varnish sort of compared against ColdFusion or Varnish compared against IAS or Apache or Nginx. You can think of Varnish in addition to, right, ColdFusion and what it's capable of. It's not anything that basically you can have, I guess, without ColdFusion. You definitely need ColdFusion processing these requests, but Varnish is just another tool in your tool belt that allows you to sort of serve this many pages this fast without having to sort of worry about too many things at the application level just yet. So this is what it looks like, I guess, if you don't worry about keep alives. And I guess IAS by default doesn't have keep alive enabled, and keep alive is not enabled, and it means that basically we are not able to reuse the requests as we are running these tests. But with Varnish out of the box, again, we can do that. And for me to see what these numbers look like with Keep Alive enabled, I'll just add -K here and run this again. And you can see that numbers are even higher, right? So we have gone from, what was it, a little over 2,000 to now a little over 3,600 requests per second, right? And Keep Alive is enabled by Apache, Nginx, even IAS can enable it. It's just not done out of the box. So if it's something that you are interested in having enabled, please do, because reusing requests definitely helps out a ton. With HTTP2, this is not as big of a concern, but not everyone uses it, and that's why I wanted to point this out. So again, the same command with keep alive, 1,000 requests, 10 at a time, keep alive enabled. We're looking at some pretty crazy numbers now, even over 4,000. So it's pretty insane when you think about it. So that is this command here. So no caching, with caching, and then keep alive. So I guess if you look at what we've done here with Coldbox, this, you can think of this as something that was stood up very quickly. It was scaffolded out for this presentation. It's not a real world scenario, and you might be thinking, Varnish may not be a good fit for me because my site is far more complicated than this, right? It's not just a very simple homepage, excuse me, with a very simple hello world and an array of structs. I'm talking to the database on my website. We're talking to Redis servers. We make HTTP requests. All sorts of different things could be happening on your website, and you might be thinking there is a lot more to getting Varnish into my ecosystem than this presentation has sort of made it appear so far. So for that reason alone, I wanted to sort of do a real world test of basically what Varnish in front of a live website would look like and what numbers we could be seeing, right? So what I'm going to attempt here, and thankfully Charlie has very graciously allowed me to use his site as an example here, but I am going to put this Varnish server that I have built in front of Charlie's website and compare the requests live so that you can see what it looks like. I do not have access to Charlie's website. I have not seen the code on his website. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes. We are doing this live, so we'll see how it goes. The only thing I do know is that his website sits behind a CloudFlayer instance, so we'll see how it goes. So yeah, so let me see here. I will. Whoop, not yet. Hold on. I have to switch computers, but.
And while you're getting there,
yep.
Safe for everybody else to understand that what you're going to see is that he's not going to show his browser looking at my domain called carehart.org. He can't do that.
Right.
So for those of you watching this and wondering, wait, what's going on here? You're going to see he's going to have a different IP address or domain name that he's got, and that's going to be pointing to his cache of my site, and then he's going to show how performance works when he makes requests against that domain name or IP address, which is caching my site. If I were to say, oh, that's awesome, I want that, then I would implement Varnish in my environment, and I would redirect my carehart.org domain name to that Varnish cache, and then I'd get the benefit of this caching.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for clarifying that. That is a very good way to put it. The main benefit of this approach is, of course, you can dabble with Varnish. You can play with different settings without impacting your live website at all, right? So that's very nice. So I will.
And another key point that you kind of said in passing, but others should hear this, is that if you're a Windows shop, you may be thinking, well, I can't do this because Varnish doesn't work for Windows. But it doesn't matter. Notice he's running it on Linux. So you could have a Linux-based, Varnish-based server be what gets the request for your site. And it'll pass through what it needs to the server, which could be Windows if you wanted to. And it'll pull things from that server. And at some point, Bruno, I assume you're going to talk about the kind of stuff with this, that where the rubber meets the road is, what if somebody says, well, I want to have these requests always go through and not be cached, or I want requests with these characteristics to be cached or not to be cached. Those are all things he hasn't even gotten to yet, So some of
Exactly.
you are probably starting to think, well, wait a minute, I don't want everything cached, or I know I want something not cached. He'll cover that later.
Yep,
Excellent.
absolutely. That's coming up. Yes. So I will make a change to my Varnish config here. This is currently post or I guess pointing to that Amazon server, and I will point to my uh, mirror server, my proxy server, I guess in this case. I will write and quit, and I will restart Varnish. So at this point, if we go back to the URLs that we were looking at previously, this was, again, the Amazon server. Nothing changed about that. This is, I guess, still all working. We didn't change any of that. This, however, this IP right now is going to point to Charlie's live website, right? So I will also pull this up here, and you will see that this is his live website, and this is us serving his website via Varnish, right? That's basically all I've done here. We have a Linux box that can point to a live site, whether it's a Windows site, whether it's running ColdFusion, whether it's running PHP, it doesn't really matter. Again, to Varnish, that is irrelevant. Varnish caches whatever the backend origin server gives it. It can even be static HTML at this point, right? So we have a proxy server with this IP address that is requesting pages from Charlie's live website, and it's serving them to me as a user. And of course, if you were to go to this IP address right now, you would see the same thing, right? This is not done via, Etsy hosts or anything like that, right? It's actually live. So let's take a look at what we have here. So and Charlie, I promise I will not run Apache Bench on your website. I will not do that. um, so let's take a look at About Us page, for example. We are looking at 496 milliseconds. Let's make another request. Actually, you know what? Let me just filter out domain. Where are we at? Okay, so let's do that. So actually, oh, it dropped, so that's pretty good. So 200 milliseconds, 192. That's not too bad. This is all being served by ColdFusion. And if we do the same thing here, let me just filter this out. Domain 159. And if I go to About Us, we have nothing in cache. We get this at 249 milliseconds. When we go to it again, you can see how numbers are dropping significantly. And again, we are hovering over that same number, roughly 40 some milliseconds that we were seeing previously. So even a site that has more content than the simple scaffolded application we were looking at before, the numbers are still very, very low. And this is not just About Us. I can go to the homepage, first request, 90 milliseconds, because it was cached, or it was not cached, and now it's cached. So it doesn't matter what page I go to here. I will skip the blog because that, I guess, goes to a different URL, or the template is different. But presentations, I will click on that again. Here it's actually 150 milliseconds, probably because of the or 119 now. But yeah, there's a lot going on here, and we can gzip some of this to make it get below 100. That's not a problem. But yes, if you can see me clicking through some of these pages that are again on the blog. So home, service support, presentation, About Us, all of these are loading almost instantly. And I didn't have to go and make any changes to Charlie's live website. If he decided that he liked Varnish and he wanted to explore something like this, it would be very easy for him to do that, excuse me, without having to mess with his live website, with his code, and do anything there. We will go over different things that you do have to worry about once you start messing with Varnish. but this is basically how easy it is to get started. You don't have to think of Varnish as this, super complex tool that is full of different technologies that you have to learn overnight. No, you can play with it as little as you want or as much as you want, and hopefully, this hands-on presentation gives you confidence to do just that, right? To explore it and see how it could work for you. If you decide that it's not for you, that's fine too. But at least keep it in the back of your mind. It's something that is available should you run into scaling issues. So that is again. So by default, I think I have these pages in cache for about 2 minutes, and we can talk about how long pages can stay in cache later on. But again, as you can see, we're going over Charlie's live website, and things are looking pretty snappy. So you can test this against your live website, staging website, development, if it's accessible publicly. If it's not, then Varnish would have to be on the same network where your other servers are. But basically, at this point, once you're done testing, for example, if you decided you wanted to go live with it, all you would have to do is make a DNS change to point your live domain from the IP that it points to now to the IP that Varnish service is running on. That's basically it. So that's the real world, I guess, as real as it gets, right? We are running this live. So any questions so far about what we have covered? Nope. Awesome. So 5:40 almost. So I guess I did want to go over a few different things with the configs and some of the terminology behind sort of not Varnish specific things, but think about CDNs. They also have to worry about this when it comes to caching, and that's something that you will learn as you start playing with Varnish. Varnish doesn't really do anything that basically is out of the norm, right? Varnish sort of respects cache control headers that HTTP spec uses, CDNs use this, Amazon uses it. Everyone uses cache control headers to control how things work. Purge and ban are methods that Varnish uses for flushing cache. And I guess I will go into those now so that I can stay on time here as well. But if you're familiar with cache control headers, you may have used them in the past to sort of tell the browsers to cache CSS and JavaScript files for up to a year, for example, right? If there's no changes to those files, then don't sort of re-request them every single time, right? So that is a very good and efficient way to sort of save some bandwidth, right? If the browser is not responsible for downloading static files every single request, you can save a bandwidth, and I guess the appearance of your website loading faster is also going to be a good gain. But cache control headers are not just used for static files. They're also used for telling Varnish and other CDNs. It could be CloudFlayer, it could be CloudFront, it could be anything, right? We use cache control headers to tell these different caching applications, right? Different devices, to tell them how we want our pages to be handled, right? As Charlie mentioned earlier, what we have covered thus far is really an instance where the entire website is cached, right? And sometimes that works well. If you have a blog that doesn't change too often, you don't have comments enabled. For example, people cannot sign in to post comments, or perhaps you use Facebook or Discuss or something like that for comments, which is a third-party JavaScript library that is not impacted by how Varnish works, right? So you can have a blog with a third-party Java or third-party JavaScript commenting system, and then yeah, absolutely, you could cache the entire website, and call it a day. Of course, that doesn't work for everyone. So the HTTP spec has this very nice way of telling Varnish basically how to handle different scenarios, right? So here you will see that for a public page, you could tell Varnish by using cache control headers again that this is a public page. The maximum amount of time in seconds that I want you to keep this in cache is 120 seconds. And then here you will see that we have two different max age settings. I do not want to confuse you by this, and you will learn that both of them are very important as you start playing with it. I listed them here so that you're aware of it, but one is used to tell the browser itself, even if you were not using Varnish, for how long to cache a page, and I can show you what that looks like here. If I was, you probably didn't notice, but as I was browsing through my previous application example and browsing through Charlie's website, I did have disable cache enabled, and we're still getting these numbers, and that is because I'm telling Chrome, because I'm using Chrome in this case, to cache content for 120 seconds, but I'm also telling it to disable cache. So this was actually not taking effect. What was taking effect is this here. I was telling Varnish, disregard your default of 2 minutes, cache it for an hour, right? So that's what this does. But if I was to go to Charlie's website, and if I was to disable cache, and if I was to start browsing, now everything is cached, like, look at the numbers we're getting now. This is 1 millisecond, and it's coming from cache, right? So this is one, oh, here we go. So 1 and 2. So this is coming from cache. It's bypassing Varnish now even altogether, right? Because I've told Chrome to cache it for 2 minutes, right? Now this is a very extreme use case. You want this for your static assets, not necessarily dynamic content. If you do have sort of pages that do not change often, maybe about us, or I don't know what else sort of falls in this category, you do have the ability to cache HTML content exactly the same way you would cache static content. So again, now this is coming straight from my Chrome's cache. It's not even going to Varnish, let alone Charlie's live website. So that's what these two parameters will do. It will tell the browser, hey, this is public, or I guess first it will tell Varnish this is public. Varnish will look at this and will say, okay, if you were not giving me this other thing, I would use this, but I see this other parameter, so I will use that instead. And then Chrome sees this after Varnish sends the request back to the browser. So that's really how this very simple use case, I guess, works between your web server, Varnish, the web accelerator, and the browser. You have the ability to control every single one of the layers in the stack by using cache control. And again, this is something that is a regular header and can be served per page, right? So for example, if Charlie wanted to have his homepage never be cached for whatever reason, but about us be cached for a year, that is certainly possible, right? You would serve cache control, public, max age, whatever. Actually, max age is for Chrome. Max age would be 1 year for Varnish. And then for the home page, you would serve private cache control. Max age 0, do not cache it, no cache. And that just works out of the box, right? So even though we have Varnish sitting in front of the website, if there are pages that are sort of sensitive, and if you're working in financial industry or whatnot, there's a bunch of reports that can never be cached. Everything always needs to be live. It needs to go live the moment filings happen. So there's plenty of use cases where things should not be cached ever. And that's what cache control sort of, allows you to do. It gives you very granular control as far as what needs to happen. So, for example, some of the websites that we sort of host internally, we do this basically for all of the admin pages, for example. Basically, one easy way to do this is to just, say if the user is authenticated, serve cache control private. Anything that starts with /admin or /dashboard or /manage basically needs to be private, and then you don't have to worry about doing it per page level. And I think I like doing this with cache control headers because you can do it from your code. You can apply complex logic. You can say for this page, do this, for this long, for this other page, do something different. You do have the ability to edit Varnish config files and tell Varnish to not cache anything that begins with /admin. But that is not something I would recommend you do because it is on a different server outside of source control. You don't apply these complex, sort of business rules to it. It's easy to forget about. So I would definitely recommend using cache control headers for controlling what needs to be cached and what cannot be cached, if at all possible. So that's it about cache control headers. Any questions about those? Nope. Okay. Awesome. How are we doing on time? Okay. Not too bad. I have about 10 or 15 minutes left. So purge and ban, these are sort of, I guess you can think of these as sort of fake HTTP methods that Varnish uses for sort of busting cache, right? We all know busting cache is never easy, right? It's one of the, I guess, it's become a, I guess, a saying not just for computer science, but web developers, engineers, and everyone else. Busting cache is always challenging, but Varnish doesn't make it as hard as some of the other products do. So there's two different ways to bust cache if you need to, right? And you can think of this as, I guess, so far we have not talked about busting cache because time to live and how long we've cached content for was not a problem. If you cache something for 2 minutes and a piece of content that needed to be live on the home page is not live until those 2 minutes expire, maybe that is not the worst thing in the world, right? However, if you want to cache content for up to an hour, but something needs to go live, and you can think of this as, an event is happening and, it's not, I guess, it's not starting right now, but it's starting in about 30 minutes, but cache is not going to expire for an hour. You want to make sure that an event status is updated correctly on your live website. So you do have the ability to bust cache and refresh it before it's expired. Of course, that is super helpful and super useful. And Varnish gives you two ways you can handle that. Here I have two very rudimentary methods for doing this. I didn't want to make this, I guess, Coldbox specific or framework one specific, or whatever the case may be. Everyone uses different methods for handling this. There's different packages out there that you can take a look at, and I can share some of those resources, and you can poke me on Slack. I can help you with this. But basically, the first example is purge, which is basically telling Varnish for this specific URL, just bust the cache immediately, and make sure that very next request is live. It's coming from a ColdFusion server as opposed to Varnish, right? So, for example, if we know there was a new contact added to this page, and we wanted to make sure that those changes are reflected. For example, your application could say, once a user has been, or a contact has been added to this list, go and do a CFHTTP request with this method to this URL, and that's going to bust the cache. So very simple, very basic, I guess, in this case. However, this sort of requires you to sort of keep track of all of the URLs for different sort of, domains in your application. And a lot of times purge methods end up being called in a way that is not very dry, right? So it's lots of URLs are hard coded and it's not very scalable, I suppose. That's why Varnish offers another way of busting cache, which is by using regular expressions. And this way of handling purging of the cache is much more flexible. You can see that basically I have here selected a match on host and a URL. And basically whatever, you could tell Varnish to cache anything that begins with contacts or anything that contains contacts, or it doesn't have to be a host or a URL, right? You could also bus cache by a value that is in the header, right? So for example, if your application was to tag a page by sending, X dash tag and sort of product ID, for example, you can think of an e-commerce website where you have a product page, and that product page is listing sort of 3 related products that someone might be interested in. You could tag that page with product IDs, right? When that page is generated the first time, and then tell Varnish when this one product changes in the admin, bust any pages that have this product's ID in this tag, right? And that is very, very powerful, because the alternative to that approach is to have your application figure out, okay, someone made a change to this product, what other products are related to it, go and get these IDs, and then figure out what products are related to those products and so forth. It would be very challenging to have to do this every single time a product is updated. But basically, if you use tags for tagging pages, then you can use ban to flush all of that cache immediately. So it's very, very powerful. I would definitely suggest using ban whenever you can. Purge is very useful if you wanted to just flush cache for the entire website, which is an equivalent of, I guess, restarting Varnish service. That also happens. It busts cache entirely. But ban is very, very granular and very, very powerful. This example uses, again, host and URL, but it doesn't have to be that. You can try and bust cache for any sort of property of the response that ColdFusion would send to Varnish. And I guess I just, as I was saying this, I reminded myself that I kind of glossed over something previously, I guess, which is what exactly does ColdFusion send to Varnish, right? It's not just the source, of course, right? So Varnish does know everything about the source. It caches that, but in addition to the source, Varnish will also cache these headers, right? So that's how Varnish knows to find, pragma no cache. If you wanted to go and bust, well, not that this will be cached, that's probably a horrible example, but if you were to maybe bust by accept header and bust any JSON examples that your API may have returned, you could do that, because Varnish does have access to all of these headers. So keep that in mind, I guess. It's not just HTML content, it's not just source that Varnish caches, it also caches all the headers. The reason why I jumped into that now is because the very next thing we're going to talk about is cookies, right? This is something that Varnish sort of prevents you from having to worry about out of the box. But as your application grows, I think you will have to think about this very diligently. And the reason why this matters is you can think of sort of someone coming to your ColdFusion website. ColdFusion creates a session for that user. Session cookies get created. JSession ID cookie is there, for example. If that cookie with that unique identifier gets sent to Varnish and Varnish caches it, you can, imagine how bad that would be, because all users that would get the cache version of the page would also get the first user's session cookies, and that's definitely what you don't want. So Varnish by default does not cache any request that contains a set cookie header by the response, I guess. So if the response says, this is the first request by this user to my website, create a session for that user, send the cookies along with that request, Varnish will ignore it by default. So basically, it makes sure that cookies are not cached because that would be bad. Never, ever do that. So there are different ways for handling this situation, because you might be thinking, okay, so how do I handle this with Varnish then, right? Because my ColdFusion website creates sessions for every user, right? And there's different ways to handle that. It's a tiny bit more, I guess, outside the scope of this presentation. Again, you can find me on Slack, and I can answer any questions that you might have after this presentation as well, if you get stuck with cookies. But basically, in short terms, how this works, what Varnish will do is it will get a request from ColdFusion. If it sees set cookies header, it will strip it out before it puts that page into cache, and then before it serves back to the user, it will re-inject those headers so that cookies get created. So Varnish will effectively sort of ignore the cookies but not strip them out so that they can be sent to the user. This way, a user can have a cookie created, the session persists, but Varnish, for all intents and purposes, ignored it, right? So that's the way that typically this is handled, and something that I guess you need to keep in mind. You will see also that I have conveniently ignored cookies here to make sure that things work as expected. Let's see, what else have we got here? Okay, another couple minutes. Edge side includes, I guess, we talked about things so far at the page level, right? If you wanted to cache the entire homepage, you could tell Varnish to either cache it or not cache it, or cache it for a certain period of time that is different than any other page. But up to this point, we have only talked about caching the entire page, right? And not fragments of a page or partials or anything like that specifically. But you can think of sort of situations where, for example, you have an e-commerce website, and when you land on the home page, you can cache the entire homepage. Yeah, that's fine. You browse through categories, cache those. You go to the products page, maybe you can even cache that. But for example, if the pricing is live, you can cache everything on the products page, but not the pricing, right? Or perhaps the pricing is not live, but you add a product to the cart, and then you have the cart counter in the upper right-hand corner that says, there's one item in the cart. If that page was cached previously, that is going to continue saying 0 items in the cart. So there could be blocks within your page that you do not want cached at all. Or again, maybe the home page is cached for an hour, but this block here about Charlie is only cached for a minute, or maybe it's cached for a year. So you do have the ability to isolate different segments within a page and apply different rules to those blocks. This is not very, very common, but certainly possible. And I'm sort of pointing this out as a possibility because caching an entire page, whatever cache control headers we tell Varnish to use, may not be an option for you. So this is really what that would look like, right? You would go into your Varnish config, you would enable ESIs, and you would, in your HTML, include something like this, right? When Varnish sees this tag, it knows how to process it. And I'm linking to, or I guess I'm including count.cfm, but this can be a route. This can be, a directory with index CFM, or whatever the case may be. It doesn't have to be an actual file. If you're using, Coldbox or any MVC framework, typically you're not including CFM files like this. So this is more for demonstration purposes. You can absolutely include a fragment of a page this way and make it behave differently. So, again, very, very powerful. People don't typically recommend this approach unless you know what you're doing, right? Because you will find developers go from a single page in cache, right? They will then convert everything into an ESI. And what will end up happening is that Varnish will then make 10 requests instead of a single request to ColdFusion to request these ESIs, and the way they're included is serialized, right? So you will actually end up making matters worse. Instead of a single request that takes 500 milliseconds, you could be sending 10 requests that take 100 milliseconds each because they have to be executed in serialized fashion. And then your website is even slower, and Varnish is not helping you at all. So, very, very powerful, but be careful with how you're using it. So that is, I guess, it. And I will wrap up with a great resource for everything that I've talked about here and more. This wiki here talks about, it basically gives you lots of different examples for how to handle different things, lots of different definitions of different caching terms, and cache control policy, and different ways that Varnish takes advantage of it. So a great resource for anyone dabbling in I guess with Varnish, and something that I find myself constantly going back to. As I was preparing this presentation, I was back here just verifying that what I had in my configs was accurate. So a great resource, and yeah, definitely check it out. It will save you a lot of time.
That was great.
So yeah, I guess that's it. I kind of rushed through these last few slides. Wanted to stay on time, but that is it, I guess. Do you guys have any questions that you're curious about? Anything that I can help you answer?
And I'll say I appreciate it very much.
Awesome.
No worries.
Perfect.
This has been a very quiet group. I don't think we ever had a whole meeting
mirroring of your website.
Maybe
so
somewhere among the 270 some we had. But I really think a big, yeah, right. Sure, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely something different. Not very many people in the ColdFusion community that I have talked to have ever even considered using Varnish. So I've been sort of, I guess, trying to introduce it to more and more people.
No, my experience is that a lot of the
they're
reason
aware of
people
what's
haven't
out
done it
there.
is because
It doesn't.
a surprisingly large
I
percentage
guess some
of
people are
CF
familiar
shops are
with it,
still
within
Windows-based,
like Drupal community
and
or
a lot of the caching
WordPress or
solutions
whatnot,
out there
but
are purely
it's
Linux-based,
not necessarily
and so
anything
people have to
associated
get out of the
or linked to
mentality
and
that
exclusive
it's something they're
to
going to
PHP,
install on
right?
their
You can
machine
use it
or on one of
regardless
their
of what your
Windows
web
machines.
server
They just have
does.
to go,
So,
okay, I can either get a VM or spin up a machine that's going to be a Linux machine, or as you said, you could use something like DigitalOcean or any of this cloud-based solutions, and it's not very, some of them even
yeah.
have pre-configured capabilities. There's Docker containers for Varnish and other caching solutions. So people just have to get, for the most part, get past that, and then the door is open for them. So you've done a great job. Thank you for that. I'm glad you did your talk. And there may be some follow-up stuff that could be.
Exactly. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Right. because everybody's got a particular need, right? That they think that won't work for me, and you just have to help them
Right.
see, no, 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 we can make it work.
Awesome.
Just
Yeah, I mean, after my talk at the summit, there were tons of questions about, you know, like how could this work for me, or like this is what I have, and exactly. That's
or they
been the
can't get
biggest
past the
challenge, I
idea that
guess. Yeah,
something could be
trying
cached.
to,
I mean,
I
even when it
guess,
comes to just typical CF caching
because
capabilities,
for some people it
when
just clicks.
those
They're
of us
like, oh
who
wow,
talk to
yeah,
people about it,
absolutely, cache
they're just
control
their
headers. Yeah,
knee-jerk
that makes
reaction is,
absolute
no, I
sense,
can't
right?
cache any of
But
my
for
site.
others,
And you
it's
showed
kind of like,
already
oh,
so
okay,
many
I have
flexible
not even thought
ways,
about
either
cache control
partial
headers, or
caching or
what that
caching based
does.
on
Is
different
that even a
characteristics.
ColdFusion thing,
And there's
right?
some more that
But
you
yeah,
didn't
I
even
mean,
talk
just
about that I'd love to talk to you about and see if you might, have some other things because I've helped people see some things that just amaze them when you really understand what the problem is and what the solutions available are, you can make a huge difference. You just got to be willing to dig in. So good getting started point for a lot of people.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Very happy to have it.
Yeah, definitely agree. Yeah. Yeah. And thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to sort of present this
That is why we're here, and
to
the
everyone
recordings will
in the
help, and
community,
then
because
there may
again,
be some conversation. There's a
it's
place to
nice
have
to have a
chats on the
platform to be
site.
able
You might want to
to
go ahead and
talk
share a
about these
website. I
things
didn't
and
see.
introduce more
I
people
might have
to it,
looked away
because
for a
we've
moment.
had
If there's a
tremendous
URL
success
you want to share
with it, and
for people to get in
I
touch
definitely
with
want to
you
see others
or to
take
read more resources of
advantage of
yours
it
or
as well. So
Twitter. Well, I'll say we don't really have a place to put up presentations. People sometimes use SlideShare and stuff like that and share it that way. But if you have a site where you would put it, now
Yeah,
would be a good time
I
to
was
put that up.
gonna download my slides as a PDF and share that with you, but yeah, I guess
Well, again,
I
then you
will.
could add a comment
I
on the event site. But so just everybody here, that slides.com. Is
I
there
see.
any website? I didn't catch it. Do you have a website
Okay.
of your own with more resources of yours? I didn't. Okay.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, I use slides.com. I can just make my presentation public, and we can link to it.
How about Twitter or Facebook or LinkedIn? Anything that people want to follow up? And go ahead and put that in the chat. Go ahead and put the ID to use.
Um, I actually do not. No, I did have a website, but I'm sort of rebuilding the entire
And again, even
thing
though the group here has been very
to
quiet,
sort
there'll
of
probably be people watching the
Twitter.
recording that will
Yes, Twitter is the
definitely
best way to get a
follow up
hold of
with
me.
you with
Yes.
more questions. And speaking of that, do you do this sort of assistance on a consulting basis? Can people hire you to help with this?
There we go. So, so we do this through global reach. So we go through sort of not just, I guess, varnish caching specifically, but sort of scaling in general when it comes to high availability. There's lots of companies coming to us to help them grow their ERP systems. So not just websites, but lots of different sort of aspects to their business, APIs, microservices. So yeah, I mean, we've
Well, I
used
just put the
Varnish
URL in there, and that's the right one, correct?
a lot in
Very good. Excellent.
in lots of
All
these
right. Well,
different
that's
use
good.
cases,
That's,
in
there's no
addition
more
to, of
questions. We
course,
can go
like
ahead and stop. Sometimes people are
Elasticsearch and
waiting to
Redis
ask questions off the
clusters, and
recording, so
all sorts of
I'll say
different
thank
things,
you again
but
for the talk. And
all for
also,
different
we plan
purposes,
to
of
have
course.
Bruno on
This is
again.
specifically
He's got
for
another talk
web
from the
caching, I guess.
conference. And I guess, are you breaking that into these couple of ones that we've talked about?
Yep, that's
So
it.
it won't be that one, but a couple based on it. Dominate. Yeah. So we'll spread them out. Yeah, we'll spread them out. Yep. Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I have at least two more prepared. I don't want to
Very good. I look forward to it. All right. Well,
sort
I'll go
of,
ahead and stop the recording,
I
and then we'll see
guess,
if anybody has any questions.
exactly. So yeah, I mean, whenever you need someone,